And I like I can't remember whose video this next one is. This is really short. It's from Smart Biology. Let me just play it.
Ironically, Collins himself is using an of the gaps argument in his book, The Language of God, but it's not a God of the gaps argument, it's a Darwin of the gaps argument. And here's why. Collins sees things in living cells, in human cells, such as the apparent non-functionality of much of our DNA. And because he cannot come up with an explanation for that, he attributes it to Darwinian evolution. The problem is that the more we learn about that supposedly non-functional DNA, the more we realize that it is in fact functional. So his whole argument for Darwinism has to shrink with each new scientific discovery. Now that's a Darwin of the gaps argument.
That's the other part of this, that, you know, one of their big arguments is this idea that there's all this artifacts in our DNA or in our proteins or our RNA. And the fact that they're artifacts, we don't know what they do, then that's evidence that they must have come from something else. But as we learn more and more, we're running out of things that fall into that category. And I think, again, that's a gaps argument, which is the absence of evidence. As Christians, we believe you just haven't discovered the answer yet, right? We believe in truth. We believe that evidence will always lead you to one conclusion, and that's God. If you eliminate God as one of the options, you'll never have a conclusion because you'll never be able to prove your concept. And that's the sad thing about the religion of naturalism, is that it excludes one option, and the only option that actually matches the evidence. And it's sad that we've allowed this to be the prevailing thought process for kids, because kids are left pretty confused. As they learn more and more, it becomes less and less logical. It's a blind faith, and it's sad. Really smart people convinced that this has to be the solution, but they actually don't have a solution. They're convinced there cannot be a God, so they're looking for a solution that will support that. Yet one has not been found yet. So again, what's more evidential? A solution that matches the evidence, or a lack of solution that we can't imagine an answer for, which is effectively the time gap, the Darwin of the gap, whatever you want to call it. Any comments or questions?
Learn about the DNA, find what you said. Well, there is a reason for this and that, but they thought so many processes were left over or not useful. And now they're finding, oh yeah, like new discovery, what's already, that they already did. That's all.
Yeah, it staggers me how much detail we've learned, frankly. So much even in my lifetime that we've discovered, but none of those discoveries move us away from the conclusion that we have as Christians. They actually move you closer, I think, if you just let the evidence take you where it goes. I want to show you another video, and then we'll just chat on some things for a second. But this is a group called Discovery Science. Their videos, the kids and I watched all their videos the other day because they're most of the videos, maybe. They're trying to put this argument in simple terms. We're talking about evolution here. And he's going to talk about homology. Does anybody know what homology is? Homology is this idea that you have parts of your body that are similar to the dog, which are similar to the bat. They're similar, so it proves common ancestry instead of common design. As Christians, we say that's common design. And there have been a lot of these kind of theories over time, but I think you'll really like the way this guy approaches the problem. It's better than I can do, so I'll let you listen to him. This is out of a textbook, as sad as it may be.
You know what? I never noticed this, but my pet bat has the same number of fingers as my pet alligator. Isn't that a quinky dink? One of the main arguments Darwin used for his theory was that of homology, these odd similarities between very different animals. Why would they be so similar unless they were related? And this does make sense. After all, take siblings. They look pretty similar. They're closely related. Then take cousins or third uncles or former roommates. A weird guy down the street who's always going on about how he's a real human, but you're pretty sure he's just a stack of goblins in a trench coat. You can't fool me, I'm onto you. Anywho, Darwin wasn't the first one to notice this, but he did harness it as a central proof of the origin of species. It's to this day used as great evidence for evolution, but is it really? Here's the story. Careful observers for a long time have noticed that very different creatures have very similar bits. These sorts of ideas date all the way back to Aristotle. If we fast forward to the 1800s, anatomist Sir Richard Owen coined a term for these observations: homology. Take a look at this guy. He's got an arm that starts with one bone, followed by two bones, and then lots of tiny bones for the wrist and fingers and whatnot. Great for grabbing stuff and high-fiving. Whales and dogs have basically the same structure, but they're not so good at those things. Why in the world would that be the case? Before Darwin, biologists chalked this up to common design. Just like a painter has a particular style and reuses similar colors or themes he likes across a lot of his work, so the thinking went, similarities in animal design pointed to a common designer. A few years later, along comes Darwin, and he figured that these structural similarities were important evidence for his theory of evolution. So, rather than a common designer, he instead credited common ancestry. But which is the proper explanation for these obvious similarities? Enter biologist Tim Barra. Guys, I've got a really good illustration. It'll totally put this question to bed. If you look at a 1953 Corvette and compare it to the latest model, only the most general resemblances are evident. But if you compare 53 and 54 side by side, and so on, the descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. The evidence is so solid and comprehensive that it can't be denied by reasonable people. In using this analogy, Dr. Barra actually demonstrates precisely the opposite of what he intended. Here's why. A succession of even very similar forms doesn't demand common descent. It could, in this case it does, and instead point to a common designer. These guys, the engineers at Chevy. Intelligent agents are free to reuse things however they want. Just like I use the same password, FluffyBunny123, for everything I do online. So the question remains open, is homology due to common design or common descent? Because the argument was so central to Darwin's case, his followers eliminated the question by simply redefining the word from simple similarity to meaning similarity due to common ancestry. They baked Darwinism into the definition of the word. Homology now typically means similarity due to common ancestry. It's a clever way to end an argument if you can get away with it, but for anybody paying attention, it's a baldly circular one. Common ancestry because common ancestry. We got a flag on the play, circular reasoning, illegal use of logic, 5-yard penalty, repeat the 4th grade. Oh come on, no serious biologist could possibly make that mistake. Nobody defines homology that way and then uses it as evidence for evolution. Come on, people couldn't possibly be that dumb. The circular argumentation is still regularly used in high school, even college level textbooks, and many a YouTube video. The surprising thing is that many otherwise very smart people didn't realize this. However, more and more people are seeing the problem for what it is. So what are the options in trying to solve this problem and escape the vicious circularity? Seeing their success at redefining homology, some tried to redefine circular reasoning too. Alright, let's see here. Whoa, it's not circular reasoning. Let's call it reciprocal illumination. Fancying up a term doesn't really change the argument. Did you order a pizza? I told you I'm making meatloaf. Oh, this isn't pizza, it's an elliptical caloric transmission device. Oh, okay. Gahoo! Wait a second. Other attempts were made to escape the circularity, but they had to give up on homology as evidence, and instead they looked to other lines of evidence for common ancestry, namely DNA. Eyeballing bones was a bit subjective anyway. It's kind of like trying to guess what someone's thinking by looking at their face. Oh wow, I wonder why he looks so sad. You think somebody died? It's hit or miss. But if you could look deeper by, say, reading his diary, you'd be able to see what's going on with far more precision. Dear diary, today was all-you-can-eat Taco Tuesday and I forgot to wear my stretchy pants. I could only eat 7 tacos, and I forgot to add extra guac. This day couldn't get any worse. This is pretty much exactly what scientists do when sequencing DNA. They're able to move to the more objective realm of cold, hard numbers. If you look at different creatures' DNA, The rule of thumb is the more similar, the more closely related, and vice versa. Biologists expected to see a gradual branching path of DNA mutations from species to species, and they did find some success. Take, for instance, this little guy. He's a gene called cytochrome C. You can find a version of him in such places as your handsome or beautiful self, chimpanzees, dogs, moths, even yeast. He's one of the most commonly sequenced portions of DNA, so it's a great test case to see if the similarities hold up and point toward common ancestry. So, if we compare your cute little cytochrome C to this ugly, hairy chimpanzee cytochrome C, they look exactly alike. Weird. With dogs, there's about 90% similarity, moths about 2/3 similar, and yeast only about half similarity. Wow, just what we'd expect. These results must be really strong evidence of common ancestry. Whoa, no! Who let you in here? Shoo, get out of here! Meet cytochrome B. He's a lot like C, except he likes to throw monkey wrenches into Darwin's expectations. He's just one example of many. If Darwinism is true, we should be able to construct a reasonably consistent family tree pretty much no matter what genes we compare. But that's far from the case. In reality, using genes like cytochrome C as evidence for common ancestry is just a good example of molecular cherry picking. Depending on what genes are used, biologists will come up with wildly different ancestry and contradictory trees of life. Comparing different animals' cytochrome B genes, scientists found cats and whales cavorting in the primate club, kicking poor little cute little tarsiers out into the cold. Frogs and birds and fish carrying on together in their own strange little group, and even sea urchins masquerading as chordates. It's madness! Molecular evidence, as it turns out, does very little to support homology. It's basically a big, wet blanket for the hopeful biologists who study the field. So, homology can't be used as evidence for evolution because it assumes the very thing it's trying to prove. And when biologists try to fix it by pointing to DNA or other areas, it only further undermines the case. Now, to be fair, doing away with homology doesn't necessarily disprove Darwinism, but it is illustrative of the kind of lazy thinking that's common among many Darwinists. Bad arguments can simply get passed on uncritically. All homology proves is that scientists are just like everyone else, people, and we can be uncritical of things that we want to believe. But what about all the other lines of evidence? We've got biogeography, embryology, antibiotic resistance, whale evolution, even vestigial organs, for crying out loud. Is this kind of lazy thinking when dealing with evidence for evolution a one-off mistake in biology, or is it more pervasive? That's a great question for another video.
What do you think? It's really cute, and I think it's really good science. He's got maybe a couple dozens of these videos, and I think there's about 20. No, they're less. Long story. If you search "long story short," you'll find him. It's a Discovery Science is the overall group, but long story short is this group, and he points out the fallacy of these concepts. It's like they can imagine it, but when they look at the data, they have to actually pick and choose what they present, because if they just present the data, it doesn't support their view. The genetic one is a real common one. They always parade out cytochrome C, but nothing else supports that same. The problem is, if you do the branching studies with DNA, they never are consistent family trees. So obviously, I cannot have genes inside me that have different ancestral trees. It's impossible. So that method, it just doesn't work. And ideally, I mean, you'd have to do a tree for every gene you have, and it'd have to be the same tree if that theory works. So it doesn't work. Although they still hold to it, but it is a bit crazy. But I like these guys. That's the reason I wanted to give you a chance to listen to them. So biology shows us that there's consistency to the path. And what I think is so funny about evolution is evolution has to claim a directed sequential process. Does that sound random to you? I mean, their very premise is opposite of their premise, because they have to have random events to begin, and then somehow after it begins, it's not random anymore. Now they'll come back and say, oh, it's random mutations is what causes, but it's directed functional mutation. It's not random, because random doesn't get you anyplace. It has to be very specific. And so they're kind of trying to play the game on both ends of the equation at the same time. And we have not really even talked about DNA. DNA is incredibly complex. Like I said, it's about 3.5 billion characters long, and it provides specific information. One of the proofs for God that we haven't discussed in here is information itself. We take it kind of for granted that you can actually draw data or information from things in the world. How do you do that? There's no chemical reason to do that. There's no physical reason to do that. That's really metaphysics, right? The ability to draw information from something. Go ahead. Okay. So, I always go back to what Bill Gates said about DNA, and this quote has kind of haunted him a little bit, but it's still out there. He looked at DNA and says the most complex computer software he's ever seen. Far beyond anything that has ever been written. And it's still the case. But what we don't understand and people don't talk about is DNA is this much of the picture. You saw a little bit of what was going on in the cell that's outside of the DNA. And without those components, you can't replicate DNA. You need all these different things that are directed in function. They appear to have intelligence to them, yet they're at the submolecular level. How is that possible?
We're not even talking about the functionality.
Yeah.
Like how it works, balance the body. It's just amazing.
You think about one cell and all this complexity. You got all these proteins, you got all these amino acids, you got fatty acids, you got all this different stuff working together. There's information embedded in every one of these molecules. It's not just DNA. In fact, DNA alone can't do anything. What I find amazing is okay, you and I started from 2 single cells, okay? But I have fingernails and toenails and kneecaps and eyeballs. How'd that... One cell? Your organs, your skin, all those things that make you up came from one cell with one set of chromosomes. And you look at all my different cells, and they have the same genetic makeup, yet they have different function. So it's outside of the cell. There's layers and layers of functionality and intelligence that goes into our design that can't be explained by mere chemistry, because the exact same chemistry is used to do different things. And one of the things I find remarkable about DNA is it's usually read in 3-letter sequences, right? But it doesn't have to, if it's ACG, it makes a certain protein. If it's GCG, it makes the same protein. And we don't understand why the message, you can knock one amino acid out and you still get the same product. It's like it self-corrects itself. It has its own whiteout function, right? The cell knows what it's supposed to do and still makes it, even though the message is different, because it depends on what proteins are hooking onto the DNA, what is produced. And that's totally outside of the DNA. There's so many levels of intelligence in our design. We don't understand the complexity, because the exact same piece of DNA can make 3 different kinds of protein, and that's only what we know that it does, right? So life is very complex, very ordered. There's no randomness to life. The things in the origin of life research that they say they've done, none of them are steps in the pathway of creating a living cell. They just aren't. They're not even the right components. I've seen research papers where they talk, we made this, and you look at their spectrum where they're measuring what's in it, and you're looking at it, and it's like, if I turned that in organic chemistry when I was in college, I would get an F. Because there's nothing discernible from the spectrum. To say that there's something there, it could be, and it probably is there somewhere, but if it's not discernible, it's not useful in And when you're talking about life systems that have to be incredibly pure, that nonsense could never turn to life because all those pollutants are going to compete. What happens outside of a living cell is the different forms of a given protein, let's say, they're more desirable in nature itself, so they replicate. They use up all the resources. So the ones that are good for living cells are not the ones that are selected in the chemistry that happens outside of a living organism. Biochemistry is just everything inside a cell works different than it does outside the cell. It's like it was designed that way, because it was. So, okay, real quick.